a short summary of the life, accomplishments, and legacy of Al Capone, one of the most notorious gangsters of the Prohibition era and of America in general. Al Capone was born on January 7th, 1899, to Italian immigrant parents in Brooklyn, New York. His father worked as a barber, and his mother worked as a seamstress. They were pretty much your average working-class folks. He was expelled from school at age 14 for assaulting a female teacher, hitting her in the face, even though he had actually showed quite promising grades early on and showed promise just as a good student in general. After he was kicked out of school, he worked small jobs around Brooklyn and sort of got mixed up with some bad crowds, including the crowd of Johnny Torrio, also another notorious American gangster. Torrio sort of took Capone under his wing, and Capone saw Torrio as somewhat of a mentor and another father figure. Shortly after he married his wife, Mae Josephine Coughlin, they moved to Chicago. This move was because Torrio invited Capone to move up to Chicago, where Torrio worked for an even bigger crime boss. This crime boss was Colosimo. I always mess that up. Torrio was an enforcer for Colosimo, a big Chicago crime boss, and took over after Colosimo's death, which led Capone to serve as Torrio's right-hand man in one of the largest crime operations in Chicago. Organized crime and mobs in general were very shifty. There were always suspicious deaths happening and power changing hands rapidly. This was just the nature of the game. After arranging for the murder of a rival gang leader, something which Torrio actually rarely did, he was shot when he was ambushed after returning from a shopping trip, leading him sort of into an early retirement. He was really scared about what happened to him, and he just wanted to get out of the game, but luckily for him, he had sort of a trusty sidekick slash pupil to hand over his operation to, and that was Al Capone. This is sort of how Al Capone climbed the ladder and became a crime boss, became a criminal mastermind. Al Capone's reign of terror. Al Capone was most famous for using his operation to bring in alcohol during the Prohibition era, mostly whiskey from Canada. While Capone's predecessor Torrio was much more cautious about initiating gang conflicts or using violence in general, as he usually sought to come up with a diplomatic solution to any problems that would come up, Capone was an entirely different animal in this regard. He had members of his gang commit violent acts regularly against rival gangs or shops that had refused his efforts to sell his bootlegged liquor to them. The most infamous of these acts is known as the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, during which 7 members of the rival Moran gang, led by Moran, were gunned down with automatic Thompson submachine guns. This attack was successful in its attempt to cripple the Moran gang, but had actually failed to get the leader of the gang. This was a very clever attack in that 2 what would seem to be police officers strolled into the hideout of the Moran gang, but they were actually Capone's men in disguise. They pushed the Moran gang members up against the wall, and then 2 more of Capone's men came in with Tommy guns and mowed them down. This was a pretty bold attack for organized crime at this time. The feds or the cops hadn't really seen stuff like this before, because normally organized crime was about sending messages, but not so publicly. It was Valentine's Day, and there were people on the streets of Chicago, and suddenly they could hear gunfire from a few blocks away in this little garage that happened to be the hangout of this gang. Although his attack was successful at crippling the rival Moran gang, it had the unintended consequence of turning serious federal attention onto Capone's operation. The consequences of this. Within a few years, Capone was arrested for tax evasion. Not the biggest crime they could have gotten him on, certainly, but the federal agents that were after him were trying to sort of use this as a crowbar to sort of pry into more of his life and at least get him off the streets for a little bit and disrupt his operation to prevent some of the violence that was happening on a weekly or monthly basis in Chicago. After he was caught, he spent time in Alcatraz prison off the coast of San Francisco, one of the most famous prisons in American history. His time in prison disrupted his operation, but it still continued. Shortly after Capone was released from prison, he died of a stroke in 1947 at only 48 years old. His outfit in Chicago continued to operate, but with much less open violence. Honestly, I think Al Capone is an important figure in American history because he sort of brought a new definition to organized crime, which people hadn't seen before. And, it wasn't a good thing, but it did change the way that organized crime worked. He was the most famous gangster of the Prohibition era. He inadvertently built support for laws down the road, such as the assault weapons ban, through his violent use of, Thompson submachine guns, and sort of cemented the Tommy gun, for example, as a piece of, I guess you could say, a cultural icon. A lot of people, when they think about gangster movies of this era, or they think about gangs of this era in general, they'll imagine weapons like that, these sort of World War II and occasionally pre- and post-World War II sort of classic weapons that the public became very afraid of and helped support the banning of. And he also bolstered support for the repeal of Prohibition in a way by showing the government how much trouble it would be to have to deal with a black market for alcohol and spirits. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this presentation. These are the sources I used. I know Wikipedia is not really accepted as an acceptable source, but I did sort of use it. But here are 3 other sources that will count as legitimate sources that I also used as well: history.com, fbi.gov, and britannicaencyclopedia.com. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the presentation. Thank you.